Um, well, we're going to discuss on mental health and mental wellness, and a brief definition of the terms will come in handy. Well, mental health is basically defined as a state of well-being, um, uh, and in which every individual is able to realize their potential and cope with the stresses, normal stresses that we normally have in our lives, but be fruitful and contribute positively to our community. Whereas mental wellness is where it's an active process where we are aware and make choices of our daily living and lifestyle to be able to be successful in our existence. So, in a nutshell, is that health is a state of being, whereas wellness is a state of living a healthy lifestyle. So to get it right is that wellness is a matter of choice. The things that you do on a daily basis, the things that you engage in on a daily basis will definitely affect your health. So in a nutshell is wellness is a matter of choice, and therefore health depends on your wellness. In this, moving on to the next slide, in this times where mental health and wellness is very important and very core because of the pandemic that we are in, understand that we have risks in developing mental illnesses, because as I had suggested earlier, I mentioned that mental health is a state of being, but wellness is where the choices that you make on a daily basis. So the effect of this pandemic has been immense, largely because of the various activities that have been hampered because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also the restrictions that we have in our society, as it were, because of one, if one has been affected or infected by it, you're either being quarantined or isolated, and this has various effects on our mental well-being and mental health. There are also other activities, the routines that we have, our work has largely been affected, our livelihood. People have lost jobs. Other employees have had pay cuts. Revenue for business people has reduced because the, um, the business environment has been affected by it, because we're not having so many people going outside. We having lockdowns for that matter. So many businesses have been affected. Service industry has been affected. Even hospitals themselves. Many would think that hospitals are having a booming business right now, but it might not be the case for all of them, because people are afraid even to go to clinics, so their revenue has also been affected. So business, as it were, is not normal anymore. The new norm has disrupted the norm that, as it was, we knew it. So things to do with loan repayments, we have had that in the clip before, where ABSA has gone, taken a step and even giving people breaks, a holiday in loan repayments, because of the economic slump that we have in the business environment has been largely affected by the COVID-19. So this has led to levels of loneliness, even the risk of developing mental illnesses such as depression, anxiety, even leading to other mental conditions like drug-induced psychosis, because of the unhealthy way of coping with these stresses. Where you have economic losses and such, and being in isolation and quarantine for a long time will affect your mental health. And as such, you would also realize that things to do with self-harm and suicidal behavior are expected to rise and are actually on the rise. So the other thing is that we also recognize that the stigma associated with COVID-19 has large implications on people, in our mental health and in our mental wellness, because people in the society, or the society as it were, are shunning those who have been infected by the virus, even after recovery. And this has a large impact in our mental health and wellness. So the risk of developing mental illnesses is quite high in this, and caused by the effects of this pandemic in the populace, and largely even as it protracts for a long period. Remember, for us, All this began somewhere in March. Realized other countries like China, who have had this for longer, even though they have contained it for now. Countries like the USA still having to grapple with the pandemic, as it were. I mean, the longer it takes, the effect of it in our mental health and in our mental illness is so high. So as it protracts, we know that it's going to make a large impact on our mental health and wellness. We can move on to the next slide. We understand that, so in this regard, cases of mental illnesses, such as depression, we talked about anxiety, we talked about drug-induced psychosis, other mental illnesses such as addictions will be amplified with the persistence of this COVID-19 pandemic protracting for a longer period. And we've talked about the end spectrum of suicide also being a risk as well. The other aspect that probably I may not want to forget about is the domestic violence. Remember, during this period of the pandemic, we have largely been at home, being quarantined, being isolated, being in lockdown. So a large number of us even working from home. So we need to have our homes to be a safe space to work, a safe space to live in, but realize that the stress and the pressure that we have because of economic losses, some have had pay cuts and lost jobs, and with unhealthy coping mechanisms has led to domestic violence, making home, which was supposedly to be a safe space, not being too safe for us. And in Kenya right now, the Minister of Public Service, Youth and Gender Affairs has reported about 42% increase in the number of domestic cases in our country. You can see how this impact, how the COVID-19 has impacted on the domestic violence. And this is not quite good, because it will probably perpetuate the risk of other vices as well, because when young children are also exposed to such domestic violences, they don't turn out to be too well, because they end up to copy the violence that they see, and this and all that kind of vices that will happen in our society. So the ripple effect will be quite immense. We are yet to see much of it right now, but later on, as we progress, we might see a lot of the ripple effects thereof that will occur. Indeed, the need for a more holistic approach in tackling this pandemic in our society is evident, and we shouldn't just be looking at the infectious aspect of it, although it's important, but it shouldn't be the only focus for us. We should be looking at the mental health, because mental health and wellness is a core aspect, and it should not be left to chance. Because then we may not have the opportunity that this pandemic as well has accorded us to deal with the mental health and wellness issues. So I like it that we are talking about mental health and mental wellness, because we are not leaving it to chance, because if we leave it to chance, then we may not have that opportunity to deal with this. Just a snippet on the numbers on how this mental health, we can move to the next slide and just look at a snippet of how this thing is affecting us. Next slide, please. We can see that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, we can see with the numbers here that we have an estimated about 260 million people worldwide suffering from depression. This was before the pandemic, and as I alluded to, I suggested that these numbers, we might see an increase of this because of the pandemic, largely because of the effects that we are seeing. And 1.9 million Kenyans were also suffering from depression. This is just the numbers before the pandemic, and we are yet to see an increase of this. So it's important that we give the due attention to mental health and wellness, because it's very important. About 877,000 people worldwide commit suicide annually. You see, that's a huge number. About 1,408 suicide deaths per year in Kenya. And a recent survey still indicates that 20% of people go to work experience suicidal thoughts. And the thing is this, in society, because we still have the stigma of mental health and mental wellness, especially the stigma on mental illnesses, is that a large number of people, even workers, will still go to work when they have the suicidal thoughts and not want to talk about it, believing that once they talk about the suicidal thoughts or ideation, that they will be deemed different, and it might be seen that they will actually go ahead. Remember that talking about the suicidal ideation will not necessarily lead you to actually doing it. As we say, a problem shared is a problem half solved. So talking about it as well will also enable the people around you to look after you, in the sense that you do not tip over to where you actually go ahead and do the act, because we know about it's the 4 times the number of women actually have the suicidal ideation, but do not actually do it. But it's 4 times more for men to actually complete the action. So you can see the disparity there. Men actually are more prone to completing the suicide vis-a-vis women, and that largely can be something to do with them sharing their problems, talking about it, having groups where they talk about their issues, but men largely just can it up and blow up much later. So it's important that mental health and mental wellness should be destigmatized, so to speak, such that we are able to help one another. And you can see that the global effect of lost productivity is up to 1 trillion per year. Based just on depression and anxiety alone. This is just a small spectrum of mental illnesses that we have. But there are others like schizophrenia, things to do with drug addictions. But just on depression and anxiety alone, and which is largely a high risk because of the pandemic that we're having at the moment, 1 trillion per year is lost in productivity is a huge amount. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at on coping strategies. So coping refers to cognitive and behavioral strategies that people use to deal with stressful situation or difficult demands, whether they are internal or external. By internal, we mean the emotional beat. External meaning that the things that are actually happening around you. Sometimes we need to cope with things that happen to us, and other times we must cope with things that happen within us. So there's that stress within and stress without that we need to cope. So these coping skills or mechanisms are not the same as defense mechanisms. The defense mechanisms are generally unconscious processes that people are unaware when they're using, such as projection. That is one of the defense mechanisms that probably we could have. It's a negative defense mechanism, where an example would be you've been lashed at the office, but because you do not have the power to lash back at your boss, then you lash out at your spouse or your children at home. So that's a projection kind of defense mechanism. So they're not the same. Yeah. Coping and defense mechanism, that is basically the difference, because coping mechanisms are the skills or the strategies that you use to deal with the stressful situations. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at the positive skills, coping skills, and vis-a-vis the negative coping skills. An aspect of positive coping skill is journaling, just writing down your feelings. It's known all over the world to be one way of actually getting out the emotions that you have, and being able to cope with that situation, as it were. Positive talk is very important. How you speak to self is very important. It has a way in how you think about yourself, the emotions that come from within. So positive talk as well is a coping skill. Spending quality time with your partner or family is an important aspect. I understand right now we've talked about domestic violence, but being able to spend quality time and talk over things can be a positive way of coping with stress. Seeking help. Even in work environments, we have what we call the employee assisted programs, the acronym being EAPs. are very important. I know ABSA has one where you're able to seek help either through a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and getting help is very important. Doesn't mean that you're weak, but it means that you have actually recognized that there is a problem and you require help. Engaging in hobbies. One of the things to do with things like mental illnesses such as depression, such as anxiety, or schizophrenia. These illnesses tend to actually make people to have that social withdrawal, moving away from people, having symptoms, what we call like an adenone, where you do not feel you have any pleasure in any pleasurable activity. So engaging in hobbies will help in coping. Being involved in community work, but not too much, to the extent that you do not have time for yourself. Remember, when you engage too much in work and not remember to have time for yourself is also a negative. Like, just look at the negative coping skills, things to do with addiction, being engaged in a lot of drinking too much, gambling, being involved in violence. These are negative coping skills. Isolating yourself, or what we call social withdrawal, repressing those feelings or those emotions that you have, such that you do not want to remember the bad things that have happened, and not tackling them, as it were, is a negative coping skills, because you'll definitely blow it up once it gets out of hand. Self-harm and suicidal behavior is also a negative coping skill. Being a workaholic, so as to avoid dealing with circumstances. Again, this is a negative coping skill. Moving to the next slide. So health is a state of being, and whereas wellness is a state of living a healthy lifestyle. Remember that your wellness will definitely affect your health. So the choices that you make on a daily basis are what will either determine whether you are healthy or not. So wellness is a matter of choice. Choosing to overindulge, like in things to do with alcohol or on certain addiction, will definitely lead you to mental illnesses, things to do with drug-induced psychosis, addictions with either nicotine or other drugs. Therefore, your health depends on your wellness. Remember that there is a quote saying that it is not the load that breaks you, it is how you carry the load that breaks you. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And you ended it off so amazingly. And I think just a quick follow-up question. You've mentioned some of the negative coping mechanisms. So if we are seeing this in some of our loved ones or our colleagues, how are we able to help them then, start adopting positive coping mechanisms?
Thank you so much, Mpilo, for your question. That's a very important question. Like I mentioned, in one of the positive coping mechanisms is to seek for help. Largely in our society, we have stigmatized even mental health practitioners, such that we do not want to engage them. And this is one of the ways in being able to help one to change from a negative coping skill to a positive coping skill. Remember, when you seek help from a professional, such as a psychologist or a psychiatrist, there are skills that they can impart to you, or coping skills that they can enable you to get to. Looking at your problem, as it were, it may seem to be insurmountable, but we'll break it down to smaller, manageable pieces using strategies such as what we call CBT. It's a cognitive behavioral therapy. This is a psychological way of a psychotherapy of treating the patient. Again, if a patient or if the person is unwell, believe they may be having depression or anxiety, we may put them on medication to the extent that we lift them up from their depressive mood, and from there keep doing psychotherapy, like I mentioned on CBT, so that they can view their life or their challenges differently and handle differently. Remember what I said, it is not the load, but it's how you carry the load.